Welcome to Cracking the IR Code. I am Stacie Buck, President and Senior Consultant of RadRx in Stuart, Florida. So we are back with case study number 3. So I am not on camera today. I have a new webcam and I need to play around with the settings in the different apps to be able to get it to function optimally. So you're not seeing me today, but you're going to see the case study, which is much more important for you to see the case study than to be looking at me while I'm speaking about the case study. So this week I have chosen a case that features an abdominal aortogram with a bilateral runoff study, followed by an angioplasty and also a stent placement. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first piece of information that we want to look at in our report is the clinical indication to determine which codes we are going to be using for our lower extremity intervention. Whenever a patient is being treated for occlusive disease, then you will use code range 37220 through 37235. And then if a patient is being treated for non-occlusive disease, then the angioplasty and stent codes would change to the 37236, 37246, the 47, and so on. So here we see that the patient presents with chronic bilateral calf claudication. So that tells us that we're looking at treating occlusive disease. And then, of course, when we get into the details of the report, it's going to confirm that that is indeed the case with the patient. So first of all, we can start by taking a look at the procedural steps to get a feel for what the doctor is going to be doing, or what we're going to see as we go through the report. I don't code from a procedural step list because oftentimes you may not have the level of detail in the report to code what's on the procedural step list. But I like to start there to just get a feel for what the physician is doing and get an idea of what I'm going to be looking for. So we see that the physician is performing an abdominal aortogram, pelvic arteriography, also the bilateral lower extremity runoff. We see angioplasty of the popliteal, the superficial femoral artery, also with a stent placed in the superficial femoral. And then we see angioplasty of the left hypogastric and also angioplasty of the left external iliac artery. So we have an idea of what's going on with this procedure. What we'll find is when we get into the details of the procedure is that if we had coded based on the list of procedural steps, the codes would look different from what we actually come up with when we get into the details of the report. So first of all, we see that conscious sedation is being used for this procedure. Now in this particular report, we don't have that full statement that we normally want to see about the supervision and whatnot in the report. So you would want to go elsewhere in the medical record and look at the documentation for the moderate sedation and verify the time for the moderate sedation, which we don't have here, but you would be able to code for that once you verify the correct amount of time. So now let's jump into the actual report itself. So I'm just going to jump into the blue sections, the highlights here. So the first key point that we want to look at in the report, it says using the Seldinger technique, the right common femoral artery was percutaneously accessed, followed by placement of a 5 French sheath. So right here, as soon as the physician punctures that right common femoral artery, that would be a 36140 for that catheterization, but the physician didn't stop there. The physician actually moved that pigtail catheter into the abdominal aorta to the level of the renals. And then at that point, the catheterization code was 36200, which means the 36140 would have been bundled with that. But the physician isn't going to stop there, so that aorta catheterization 36200 is going to end up being bundled. So we see that the physician did an injection of contrast for an abdominal aortogram, then mentions that the catheter was repositioned just above the aortic bifurcation, and then did an injection of contrast for digital pelvic arteriography. Then with the catheter in the same place, did a bilateral lower extremity runoff. And then it says images were evaluated. So here we see an abdominal aortogram was performed, the pelvic aortogram, and the bilateral extremity runoff study. Now, we don't have all of the necessary details for the findings here, but when we go further in the report and we look at the findings section, we will actually see that the findings section supports the 75625 and also the 75716. It's not uncommon for the physician to do what's called pelvic arteriography if you will, and there's nothing specific to code for a non-selective pelvic arteriogram. So that typically is going to end up being part of code 75630. If that had been assigned here, if it had been the runoff study from one catheter position, or sometimes it ends up being reported as part of the extremity study, the 75716. It would not be appropriate to use the 75736 here because that's for selective pelvic imaging. So that kind of gets wrapped up in the abdominal aortogram and the bilateral extremity runoff that the physician is performing here. So let's go on and then let's look at the intervention that was performed. It says over a guide wire, the catheter was exchanged for an SOS Omni catheter, which was formed in the upper abdominal aorta and was used to select the origin of the left common iliac artery. Now here the catheter was moved further into the contralateral common iliac, which would have been a 36245 at that point, but that catheter work ends up being bundled. It's going to ultimately be bundled into the intervention, so there actually is not going to be a catheterization code assigned at all, regardless of how far the catheter goes. So from the common iliac, then the catheter eventually made it down into the superficial femoral artery, which would have been a third order catheterization. And then it makes it into the proximal popliteal artery, which is also still that third order catheterization. And again, that's going to be bundled with the intervention. So here we see the physician does an intervention. The catheter was exchanged for an angioplasty balloon catheter, and then that was used to dilate the occluded segment of the superficial femoral artery. At that point, the code that was assigned was 37224 for angioplasty of that superficial femoral for occlusive disease, but the procedure continued where the physician actually then went and placed that stent graft across the superficial femoral artery. So when you have angioplasty and a stent placed in that femoral popliteal territory, that's going to be code 37226 for treating occlusive disease. And then after the stent was placed, the physician did additional angioplasty, which of course is going to be bundled. So then from there, after there were multiple angioplasties done in that femoral popliteal territory, then the physician moves on to the iliac territory. So there it says the wire was redirected into the left hypogastric. Over this, a 7mm balloon catheter was passed for serial balloon angioplasty of its origin. And then it says the guide wire was then repositioned in the external iliac artery, and the 7mm balloon catheter was again used to angioplasty its origin. So this is where it's important to pay attention to the detail in the documentation, because if we go back to our procedure list over here, we see that this would indicate that we have two separate angioplasties occurring, one at the left hypogastric and then one at the left external iliac artery. But when we come over here and we're looking at the section of the report where we actually have the detail for the intervention, it's talking about the origin. We see the origin of that left hypogastric. We see origin again. It says the catheter was again used to angioplasty its origin. So even though the catheter was moved, when we read this, what we're seeing is it was that same lesion at the origin that's being treated. So that would actually only be one intervention that we're reporting. So it was treated from two different directions, if you will, the one lesion. So that's going to be one intervention, one angioplasty, which is going to end up being 37220. And then if you jump down to the findings section, under the left runoff section, I've underlined there the findings, where the findings mention that 70% origin stenosis. And so we're not seeing that there's a separate stenosis documented in that iliac territory. Again, we're just seeing the one. So that's going to lead me to only code for the one angioplasty, the 37220. And then also it's important to come to the findings section if you were coding this report in real time, and I hadn't already been coding it for you as we went through it, to verify that all of the findings are documented to support the imaging codes that are assigned. So if we look at the abdominal aorta findings, whenever we're going to assign code 75625, there are some key things that we want to look for. We want to look in the report for the findings for the origins of the renal arteries, the celiac, the inferior mesenteric, the superior mesenteric. That ideally is what you want to see as part of a 75625. Now, I can tell you, practically speaking, you don't necessarily always get all of those elements documented. I believe that that's something that should be discussed with the physicians because they're injecting contrast and they're probably seeing all of the origins of those vessels. They may not be commenting on them because maybe there's no abnormality. And I think this case is a pretty good example where when we look at the findings here of the abdominal aorta, it mentions the suprarenal abdominal aorta. It mentions it mentions the findings for the renal arteries. So, and then it also goes on and it mentions findings for the lumbar and inferior mesenteric arteries. So it doesn't specifically mention the celiac or the superior mesenteric, but it appears here that the physician was commenting on what was abnormal and then possibly just didn't mention those other vessels that didn't have an abnormality. Based on all of the pieces of the puzzle that I'm seeing here, though, looking at the catheter positioning in the report and then looking at the findings, to me, this still is a 75625, even though the physician may not have mentioned those other two vessels, because the other findings support that catheter placement in position for that abdominal aortogram. So I would go ahead and allow the 75625 for this. And then for the extremity imaging, we see that we have detailed findings for the right extremity, also for the left extremity. So that would support code 75716. And then remember, again, that pelvic arteriogram, the non-selective imaging that was done there, gets bundled into that 75716 for those codes. So again, we have our conclusion. The conclusion is going to summarize those significant findings for us. So we've seen all the detail, we've verified all of our codes, and then here is the final codes for you to look at. So the final codes for this case, after all is said and done, we have 37220 for the angioplasty that's at the external iliac hypogastric origin. We also have the 37226 for the angioplasty and the stent in the superficial femoral popliteal territory. And then we see our imaging codes for the abdominal aortogram and then also the bilateral extremity runoff. So remember that the catheterization codes are going to be bundled with 37220, 37226. Those are not going to be reported correctly. Now, there are some scenarios where you would report catheterization codes in addition to codes from code range 37220 through 37235, but I'm sure I will find a case study for you in the future to show you the exception to those rules. So anyway, if you have any questions about this case study, any additional detail that you want to know, please feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I try to keep these as brief as possible. I could probably do an hour-long teaching on one case study if we dug into all the different nuances of the coding rules. But for now, I'm going to wrap this up, and I look forward to connecting with you again in the future for another case study. Thank you.